Vladimir Putin was the last dead person Keir Starmer should have messed with, but in true Starmer fashion, he managed to do just that, and now Putin has dropped a bombshell on him live on TV.
They try to work in sync when it comes to adjusting their strategy in terms of support for Ukraine. So we'll watch and see what comes out of the meeting this week, but I also think it's worth noting that there is mounting pressure on the Biden administration.
In a world where even whispering the name Russia sends shivers down spines, Starmer thought it'd be wise to loudly proclaim his support for Ukraine, almost like he's actively trying to collect threats like trading cards.
This is their direct involvement, and this, of course, would, in a significant way, change the very essence, the very nature of the conflict. It will mean that NATO countries, the United States and European countries, are at war with Russia.
Seriously, Keir, do you have some kind of secret life insurance deal, or are you just casually reckless? Because right after his grand gesture, Putin didn't just ignore it. He sent a massive warship armed with hypersonic missiles cruising dangerously close to the UK, a not-so-subtle reminder that Starmer's diplomatic strategy might be more of a ticking time bomb.
Over at the White House, they will discuss allowing Ukraine potentially to use long-range weapons provided by the U.S. and other Western NATO allies deep into Russian territory.
And now, thanks to him, we're all left nervously wondering just how long we have to endure the chaos fueled by this walking, talking crisis named Keir. And apparently, the ongoing issue between Russia and Ukraine is common knowledge, like kindergarten-level stuff. But somehow, our Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, seems blissfully unaware of the diplomatic minefield he's casually tap-dancing through. Take his recent trip to France, for instance.
It would, and that's why we're hearing that reaction from Vladimir Putin. We are talking about the longest-range U.S. missile that the U.S. has given to Ukraine. It's called an ATACMS. It goes around 200 miles or 300 kilometers, and the Ukrainians have essentially been begging the U.S. to be allowed to use it. At the same time, they're also asking the Brits to use an equivalent missile called a Storm Shadow. That's why it's both the British and the Americans who have to come to this decision.
This was a high-stakes showdown under the Arc de Triomphe with President Emmanuel Macron, where Starmer solemnly paid tribute to the sacrifices of French soldiers in World War I. Boldly, and I mean recklessly boldly, he used this setting to throw some verbal punches at Russia and pledge unwavering support for Ukraine. You'd think this was a dramatic, Hollywood-esque moment of defiance for European security, but here's the million-pound question. Was this grand display of solidarity actually worth what came next?
We hear that threat from President Putin. There is a question of supply. There's not an infinite supply of these ATACMS. They're quite precious, and the U.S. thinks that they could be put to better use inside of Ukraine, in those Russian-occupied areas, in Crimea, for example.
Starmer's stunt wasn't just another forgettable soundbite, it was loaded with historical weight. The last time a UK Prime Minister graced an Armistice Day ceremony in France was Winston Churchill back in 1944, when the world was a giant mess of global conflict. Starmer's presence under the Arc de Triomphe was supposed to evoke a shared sense of European resilience against tyranny. Yet, despite the deep symbolism, the mood shifted fast, and I mean whiplash fast, thanks to Vladimir Putin, who never misses an opportunity for a dramatic counterstrike.
Possibility in which the U.S. says, we don't want the Ukrainians to use the ATACMS, but Brits, go ahead, you guys can use, or the Ukrainians can use the Storm Shadows. But this would change the battlefield, Wolf. Now, to be clear, the U.S. has already given Ukraine permission to fire across the border with shorter-range missiles. But this is, again, the longest-range missile that we have seen the U.S. give to Ukraine so far.
Just hours after Starmer's high and mighty speech, news broke that Russia had sent a not-so-subtle message in the form of a warship, the Admiral Golovko. And no, this wasn't just any rust bucket floating around. This was Russia's pride and joy, bristling with hypersonic Zircon missiles. Let me tell you, these missiles aren't some cheap fireworks you can laugh off. These are the kind of terrifying, warp-speed weapons designed to outsmart the world's most sophisticated defense systems, leaving even the best military strategists sweating bullets. The Admiral Golovko showing up in the English Channel wasn't just a bit of maritime flexing, it was a massive, in-your-face warning, a chilling spectacle that screamed, "We're not playing around."
But if the U.S. and Britain do give Ukraine that permission, it would certainly send a strong message.
And Putin is suggesting that potentially could be an act of war.
Yes, and this is something that we have heard from him before. Frankly, not much would change except the range on these missiles, because these missiles, shorter range missiles, are already being fired inside of Russia.
And as if the Zircon missiles weren't terrifying enough, the Admiral Golovko is loaded to the brim with advanced weaponry. We're talking artillery, anti-submarine systems, and missile defenses that could make any top-tier naval fleet think twice before messing with it. This 443-foot monster of a warship is built for absolute domination, ready for everything from full-on combat to precise defensive maneuvers. So when Russia's defense ministry announced their little war games, it wasn't just some random drill to keep the sailors entertained. Nope, this was a bone-chilling power move, strategically placed in one of the world's busiest and most vulnerable shipping lanes.
We would like to see the U.S. to loosen those restrictions. Even if it didn't have a major military impact, it would certainly send that message about U.S. support for Ukraine, which may be a victory in and of itself for Ukraine.
The exercises took place in the narrow, anxiety-inducing section of the English Channel, where one wrong move could send global trade into a frenzy. As this military juggernaut maneuvered and helicopters buzzed overhead, with simulated enemy drones being shot down left and right, it became obvious this was more than just routine practice. It was a carefully orchestrated, high-stakes show of might. Putin's message couldn't have been clearer. Russia is ready to flex its power, and any European displays of unity, like Starmer's sentimental tributes, don't scare him one bit.
Prime Minister Starmer, specifically when it comes to Ukraine. We have reported over the course of the last few months that the Ukrainians have been pushing the United States to allow them to strike deeper inside Russia, to go after some military targets that they say are deep within Russia. The United States has been wary to allow them to do so.
Defense analysts worldwide were left scrambling, completely unnerved. Putin had pulled off a masterstroke, parking his floating fortress right between England and France as Starmer tried to bask in his moment of historical glory. Instead, Starmer's visit was overshadowed by this strategic reminder of Russian defiance, throwing his diplomatic ambitions into a spin and leaving us all feeling the palpable tension. The world is now holding its breath, fully aware that this game of geopolitical chess has just gotten a whole lot more dangerous, and our dear Prime Minister might have unwittingly placed us smack in the middle of it.
U.S. officials are concerned about fears of escalation, Russia claiming that the United States is party to this war, but they also say that there are military strategic concerns that they have. The weaponry that the Ukrainians would be using to carry out such strikes are called ATACMS, and the U.S. says there's simply a limited supply of those.
And let me tell you about the scene in the English Channel that has been nothing short of a geopolitical circus over the past few days. Russia decided to put on a full-blown military show, and it was anything but subtle. Their high-stakes exercises centered around the Admiral Golovko frigate, a menacing display of naval power that had global defense analysts reaching for the panic button. And no, these weren't just routine drills to keep the sailors entertained. They were loud, intense, and loaded with a menacing subtext. November 11th, 2024 was the big day, with the combat crew practicing defense maneuvers against simulated threats, because clearly Russia wanted to make a point, and they were making it loud and clear.
And the U.S. says there's simply a limited supply of those in the United States, but also in Ukrainian hands. And so they think that those weapons that the Ukrainians already have could actually be used in other areas of the battlefield, like Crimea. Don't necessarily need to go after those targets deep inside Ukraine. But Ukrainians I have spoken with say that there are legitimate targets, specifically when it comes to weapon production facilities that they would like to hit inside Russia.
The timing wasn't a coincidence. Keir Starmer was still in France, standing beside Emmanuel Macron, all solemn and dignified, paying tribute to World War I soldiers under the Arc de Triomphe. It was supposed to be a show of unity, a moment steeped in history. But here's the kicker. Just a stone's throw away, Russia was flexing its muscles, conducting defense maneuvers that looked suspiciously like a provocation. The drills were the full package, helicopters slicing through the sky, drones being intercepted, and enough military hardware on display to make any bystander uneasy. The English Channel, a vital artery for over 500 vessels a day, suddenly felt like a powder keg, just waiting for the wrong spark to set everything off.
Legitimate targets, specifically when it comes to weapon production facilities that they would like to hit inside Russia, and so this is a critical ask for them. President Biden said that he would be hearing from his Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, who traveled this week to Ukraine on the matter, and we know that this is something that he's going to be discussing.
And let's talk about the location. The English Channel isn't exactly the place for casual war games. It's one of the world's busiest shipping lanes, crammed with cargo ships and oil tankers. One slight miscalculation could spell economic disaster, or worse, an international incident. But did Russia care? Of course not. They brought out the big guns, literally, simulating full-scale anti-terror and defense operations as if the area wasn't already tense enough. The Admiral Golovko, with its 443-foot frame slicing through the waters, made it clear that Russia wasn't here to play. It was a high-stakes game of intimidation, and everyone watching knew it.
Try to work in sync when it comes to adjusting their strategy in terms of support for Ukraine. So we'll watch and see what comes out of the meeting this week, but I also think it's worth noting that there is mounting pressure on the Biden administration.
The political implications were brutal. There was Starmer trying to look like the hero of European security, strengthening ties with France and denouncing aggressors, while Russia practically laughed in his face. Experts have been quick to point out that this wasn't just about military posturing, it was a carefully timed power play by Putin, a reminder that Russia can and will disrupt Western unity whenever it feels like it. The message to NATO was unmistakable. Russia isn't backing down, and they're not afraid to show it. And as if Starmer didn't have enough headaches, he's also grappling with a diplomatic disaster he practically invited himself, the Chagos Islands sovereignty deal. Just a few weeks earlier, in October 2024, his government decided to hand over the Chagos archipelago to Mauritius, sparking outrage that hasn't died down. The Chagos Islanders, who have spent decades fighting for self-determination, were furious, accusing Starmer of bulldozing over international law and making decisions without consulting them. It's not just a slap in the face, it's a full-on betrayal after years of legal battles.
For the upcoming elections, but we are learning about how the elections could impact this war. What are you learning, and what are the implications here?
Yeah, so there's a lot of questions about what former President Trump would do when it comes to policy on Ukraine. And he was asked during a debate earlier this week if he wants Ukraine to win the war. He would not give a direct answer to that. That is typical for him. Over the course of the last year or so, he has not committed to being necessarily 100% on the side of Ukraine, simply saying that the war needs to come to an end.
Boris Johnson, never one to hold back, blasted the deal as geopolitical suicide, and he might have a point. The Chagos archipelago isn't some random set of islands. It's home to Diego Garcia, one of the world's most strategic military bases, crucial for operations across the Middle East and Asia. Sure, the base remains under US-UK control for now, but critics are losing sleep over the idea that this handover could erode the UK's strategic leverage, opening the door for Chinese influence. And if that happens, we're looking at a nightmare scenario, a shift in the balance of power in the Indian Ocean, and an even bigger headache for Western defence. The fallout from this deal has been catastrophic. Allies are losing trust, international law experts are sharpening their critiques, and the UK's global reputation is circling the drain. The fear is real. If Chinese interests gain a foothold in the region, Western security would be in for a rude awakening. Starmer's intentions might have been noble, righting a colonial wrong, but the political blowback is brutal. At a time when global tensions are through the roof, ceding a strategic territory looks like a self-inflicted wound. Starmer, who wanted to project an image of strength and stability, is now left juggling one crisis after another, with every move being scrutinised, every decision a potential catastrophe. The pressure is mounting, and the stakes have never been higher.